Good morning for everyone also who's joining through a recording. We just made a little bit of a head start already. So it is Thursday morning and we're doing our short little live online session. I will be repeating this same session in the evening at 8 o'clock. And I believe it's now week 6, so we're looking at the lymphatic and immune system. What I was just sharing with the student who is participating in a live version is that these sessions are really for you, for whatever you want to get out of them. So I'm very flexible with what they can contain. We can go through the lecture material in a quick revision kind of a style. We can go through the lab material if that helps. Or we can look at as individual assignment components if that's something that you find useful, or we can really do what benefits you, or I can kind of try to do all of it. So feel free to just jump in at any stage, Kayla, and let me know what you would like to talk about, what you would like to hear about. Before we start, though, I just wanted to take a few moments. I've been thinking, going back and forth, should I do it, shouldn't I do it? And I think that there is something to be said about not saying when there is a concern is being part of the problem. And I think we woke up this morning to a state of a world that's very concerning, and without taking political sides, without getting into the politics, unfortunate events have taken place overnight. And I think that how people and how countries and how individuals respond to that in the next coming hours, coming days will set the tone for what kind of a world we're living in. So my thoughts go to the people who are on the war zone and dealing with that, especially knowing that that's not too far from my own where I'm from. But having said all that, I think that we'll just jump to the material. Couple of announcements just for anyone who wasn't present in the class. Since it's the week 6, I was looking a little bit of the schedule. So this week we're looking at actually 2 systems, lymphatic and immune system. And there's a little bit of material on both. I think that both of these chapters are huge topics on their own. And I have colleagues who have spent years and years of looking at immune system and say that they've only scratched the surface. So I'm by no means expecting you at the end of the day to be experts of these systems, but merely to have an idea and appreciation that these are complex systems. And then next week, we're going to take our second exam and we're going to take our second practical test. Both of these are again taken through Canvas, and for both of those the same settings, same conditions that we had for the first ones apply. I will also be going through a study guide in class, and I will provide a recording of that as well on Thursday session on these live online sessions, and we'll have a look of any of the gaps in that study guide. So I don't upload the completed version of it anywhere. I provide the skeleton version of it and we'll fill it in together because all of the exam questions are pulled from that study guide. So I think it's fair that there's at least a certain element of kind of having to do a little bit of preparation of it yourself as well. But like I said, I will help you to get all set up for exam. I will help you to get set up all ready for the practical. As before, I'll provide as well the practice version of the practical. It's definitely worth of working through it, but that's next week. So this week, what I wanted to do was to discuss these two systems, lymphatic and immune system, and also have a look of the herd immunity lab that we had for this week. Another thing that if you were in a class or if you didn't have a chance to be in the class that I shared is that I have a bunch of handouts that I would typically share. And some of those I printed, and some of those I said that you can pull from here, from the canvas yourself, because really there's quite a bit of detail that we can go on to. I think that you will be able to get everything from the lecture video, but I want to provide also additional material for anyone who's interested of going a little bit beyond of just what we share. So what I'm going to do at this point, I'm going to jump to another screen and just quickly discuss the key points. Oh, that's not the lab that I'm thinking just yet. I discuss the key points of the chapter on the lymphatic system. Let's share that. That looks better. So the full story, like I said, is available on the lecture videos, on those recorded voiceover videos that I have uploaded, the links to the YouTube videos on our Canvas. So you can always refer back to that. But like I said, the lymphatic and immune system are a large topics on their own. So I think that this we'll just have to settle for the fact that this will be just a scratch of the surface, not really going into the finer detail. And like I said, we'll start with the lymphatic system. And one thing that I like to start with is just by reminding ourselves, what are the functions of this system? Why do we care about the lymphatic system? And there's going to be three main functions that I want us to pay attention. And I think that the first one really kind of refers us to the role of the immune system. Immune system is housed within the lymphatic system, but so that's why we can kind of tackle these together, and that's all to do with fighting the pathogens. So lymphatic system plays important role in dealing with any invading pathogens that might get into your body. Lymphatic system provides the kind of structures within which the immune system that's mainly responsible for this process is located. The second function is gonna be all to do with the fluid regulation. So as we will see in just a few moments' time, our cardiovascular system is not quite as perfect and quite as unaffected by things as we saw earlier on in the
even like the hallway.
In the class. Oh, sorry, I was just trying to make sure if there was anything said to me. And then the so we'll have a look of what does the lymphatic system contribute to dealing with that. And the final one that we're gonna look at, or I'm gonna mention just briefly.
I don't know if I'm gonna even be able to have appointments today.
And that I'm kind of leaving for the chapter when we look at the digestive system, is that the lymphatic system allows us to get around to the fact that some of the dietary fats that we get from the diet are actually larger than what your blood vessel capillaries can take in. And since they would not be able to otherwise be utilized by the body, this is where lymphatic system steps in, and we're actually able to catch those fat molecules with the lymphatic system, take them up and then put to the bloodstream close to the heart. So three important functions for the lymphatic system that we'll see. Another way to think about the relationship of the lymphatic system to the rest of the body is that what we'll see in just a few moments time is that cardiovascular system is constantly losing a little bit of fluids. So some of the fluids are leaking out and we need to do something about those fluids for two main reasons. Because A, we would otherwise run out of the fluid volumes of the blood, but also we would end up then having that fluid building up to the rest of the body. So we need to catch it and take it back to the cardiovascular system. So you can think of, in a way, lymphatic system as this kind of drainage system that catches this fluid that leaks out from the cardiovascular system. I think that the other reason that I like to use to start these sessions is to point out that when you go to the doctor and you tell you're unwell, and if there's a little bit of a doubt that it might be an infection of some kind, one thing that your doctor will do very early on is to check your lymph nodes. And lymph nodes are located in multiple places throughout your body, for example, here at the neck region. And what the doctor is looking for is for a swelling of these nodes. If the lymph nodes are swollen, that gives us a clue that there is infection going on somewhere in the body. And then if we know that, we might not know where in the body and how severe it is, but it allows us to start to zoom into that topic. So another important thing that we end up doing in response. I mentioned that I kind of had a plan for this session that we're going to go through three main topics when it comes to the lymphatic system. We'll talk about lymphatic vessels, we'll look at lymph itself, and then we'll talk about lymph nodes and lymphoid organs on their own. So this is where we started, and I said that I've told you about cardiovascular system so far, but actually what I've told you has been a little bit of a shortened story. It's not quite as accurate. So far I've shown you that cardiovascular system is this one-way closed loop system. So blood is pumped by the heart within the blood vessels and travels to one direction and then comes back. And it was within these capillaries where the exchange of the materials took place in the cardiovascular system and between the tissues or interstitial fluids. Well, all that is true, but what I didn't tell is that actually these capillaries fail a little bit. A little bit of fluid leaks out and the same amount doesn't get picked back in. So we have a net gain of fluid at these capillary areas on the tissues. So this is where the lymphatic system steps in. And lymphatic system, you can consider it, like I said, as a complementary drainage system. So it catches this extra fluid buildup around the capillaries and carries it back to the cardiovascular system where it opens close to the heart. So we see that similarly to cardiovascular system, lymphatic system is going to be a one-way system. But unlike the cardiovascular system, which was this closed loop that we saw, lymphatic system now is open from one end. It's going to be this end where the capillaries were. So we're catching material from one end and carrying it to the other end. These two ends don't connect. And that brings us to, let's have a look of this fluid balance discussion that I kind of hinted to earlier on. And what we're seeing here, we're seeing a section of a capillary. So what we will have here is going to be our arteries and arterioles. We have our capillary, and then we have our venules and veins. So a section of a capillary, and we're going to be focusing what happens there. Within that section, we will have blood traveling, and there's going to be this capillary filtration, exchange of materials in and out of the capillary or blood within the capillaries and the tissues around, or if not the tissues, the interstitial space between the cells and the capillaries. And of course, what we will be looking at is really blood, but the part of the blood that we're focusing on is the plasma. So red blood cells, platelets, they stay within the blood, within the capillaries. It's mainly the plasma that gets exchanged here for our purposes. there's going to be two forces that play important role for pushing material out and back into the blood vessels. And I think I mentioned these at the end of our last session. So let's have a look at those. The hydrostatic pressure was the force pushing materials out of the blood vessel to the interstitial space. And that's going to be a typical day on an average sized human being, about 20 liters of fluid that gets pushed out. 20 liters is a lot if you consider that the blood volume was somewhere between 5 and 6 liters in an individual. So we need to be recovering some of that. And actually about 70 liters of fluid gets recovered in a day back to the blood. So I'm no math expert, but I think that that brings me to a number of 3 liters that are left behind to this interstitial space that we need to deal with.
Hey, baby.
So this interstitial fluid, what we call it now interstitial fluid, since it leaks from the capillaries to the space. So it's going to be now our similar composition to plasma, but we call it with a different name. This 3 liters would be a significant loss if that happened all the time, also from the blood volume. And also it would cause an issue because now if we add 3 liters to the space between the cells every single day, eventually we'll end up looking like a Michelin man, and that's not really a solution either for us. So we need to do something with that 3 liters, and that's where the lymphatic system comes. The other thing that I wanted to mention, just in terms of the terminology, and we just mentioned that even though we're going to be looking at the blood and we talk about some of the blood being filtered, it's really the plasma portion of the blood that we're paying attention. So the composition of this fluid is largely the same at all of these places, regardless of the name that we use for this fluid, but we use different names based on the location where this fluid is. So within the blood, we have our plasma. Once the plasma leaves the blood vessel, the capillary, and goes to this space between the cells around capillaries, to the interstitial space, it becomes interstitial fluid. And once the interstitial fluid is picked up by the lymphatic system, now we call it lymph. So I always do like to ask in an exam that when does interstitial fluid become lymph? And the correct answer to that would be when the interstitial fluid enters to the lymphatic system, that's when it becomes lymph. So again, it's very closely a similar fluid at all of these places, but the name changes based on the location. So I hope that that makes sense. And this slide I left for myself as a reminder just to emphasize. So again, we're going to be looking at lymphatic system at the first part. That's kind of the anatomical framework of structures. And then the immune system is much more of a physiological system that is housed within the lymphatic system. So that might come across a little bit more abstract for many students for that reason. So we saw this diagram, and hopefully at this point now it makes sense why we need to deal with this fluid that builds up around the capillaries, and also why lymphatic system differs from the cardiovascular system in the fact that it's open-ended system. There is going to be a lot of similarities between cardiovascular system and lymphatic system though. So just refer back to what you've learned about cardiovascular system with some of these concepts. Another thing that I wanted to mention, as we are going to review through the different parts of the lymphatic system and the vasculature of the lymphatic system, we're going to be working from the open end towards the larger structures. So the size of the structure starts small and they increasingly grow as they head towards the heart. So it's almost like an opposite order from what you said, so from the arteries. So we're going in the direction of the blood flow from the capillaries, then the lymphatic system empties, to the large vessels before the heart. So we're going to start with lymphatic capillaries. And lymphatic capillaries are very similar to what you saw with the capillaries of the cardiovascular system. A lot of similar structure. Couple of things to highlight from them that is different though. They are much more permeable than cardiovascular system capillaries. And we remember the cardiovascular system capillaries already were pretty permeable. So these are even more permeable, easy to take up material here at the capillary network, around capillary networks. The other thing is that they can take up much larger molecules than the cardiovascular system's capillaries. And this goes back to what I said about the dietary fats, for example. So we're able to get material that your normal blood vessels couldn't with the lymphatic system because we're now able to deal with larger molecule size. So sometimes this can be very, very useful, and we use that to transport also other materials, proteins that we otherwise wouldn't be able to transport. But this can also become a problem for us. This is when we actually pick up with the lymphatic system some pathogens, so some invaders to the body that we shouldn't get, that shouldn't get in there because they're so large and they would cause a risk for our well-being. But now lymphatic system, since it can deal with these large molecules, large structures, large particles, it's now able to pick those up, and we have a problem at our hands. So it's kind of a win-lose situation. There's two sides to those both things. Next thing that I wanted to talk about was increasingly larger parts of the lymphatic system, vasculature, and it's going to be now the lymphatic vessels. And there's actually only two structures that I want to highlight when it comes to the lymphatic vessels. These are more in preparation for your practice anatomy. So what we see here is a view of our thorax, back of the thorax. So we've taken the anterior side of the chest away, and we're seeing the back of the chest cavity. Here we can see our superior vena cava and our inferior vena cava. We can see our trachea, esophagus, and of course our vertebral column at the back. We see the ribs nicely coming out, the back portion of the ribs. So one thing that's obvious if you look at these structures that we've highlighted here on a green color, even though they're not green really in life, they would be more whitish in cavitaric dissection. I think that we commonly use green for lymphatic system, so just use a little bit of imagination to be correct about the colors though. We'll see that there's one vessel that runs throughout the back of the thoracic cavity, kind of following that line of the thoracic cavity. This is going to be our thoracic duct. And thoracic duct expands at the very inferior most part of the thoracic cavity, becoming a cisternaculi, another structure that might be worth of being familiar with. So having said all that, I think that that gets us through the lymphatic vessels to now shift our attention to increasingly larger structures, which are now going to be lymphatic trunks. So there's quite a few important lymphatic trunks, and I provided this picture for you as a handout on the canvas, so you can always refer back to that, and that might help you if you want to go through these important trunks. One thing you'll notice, they are simply named based on the body region. So all that work you did to get familiar with the body region parts is going to be useful here. So lumbar trunk is going to be at the lower back region. Our intestinal trunk deals a lot with these dietary fats, for example, that I mentioned. We would have our intercostal trunk. So intercostal referring to between the ribs. Bronchomediastinal trunk is a nice one because the name tells us exactly where it's at. So where your bronchi and mediastinum are located. Our subclavian trunk, so again, below the clavicle, the name tells us that. And I also wanted to highlight the jugular trunk at the neck throat region. So those are some of the important trunks of the lymphatic system that I wanted to mention. And moving along, we're next going to shift our attention to lymphatic ducts, which are even bigger, even larger vessels. And a couple that I wanted to mention included right lymphatic duct here, so draining the right arm, right head, neck, and emptying to the right subclavian vein. And then we have our thoracic duct, draining rest of the body to and opening to the left subclavian vein. So good structures to be aware and notice from there. And kind of, I think we already addressed this a little bit earlier on. So edema was swelling of something. And in this case, if we're seeing lymphedema, it's going to be swelling due to the lymph building up. Well, what could cause lymph to build up, since we just saw that we had this clever system to pick up this extra fluid that leaked out? Well, in certain cases, for example, if we have tumors, if we have another reason why we might need to remove parts of the anatomical structures, we might end up removing some of the lymphatic vessels as well. Now the draining of the lymph would not work well on this area, and the lymph would end up building up as an interstitial fluid to this interstitial space, and we would see lymphedema taking place. How to tell lymphedema? Often looking at the two sides of the body becomes very useful there. You can tell that, oh, it's actually edema there. It's not just the fact that this person is larger. Of course, there is a texture difference in the tissues and so on. In the class last night, we discussed that in quite a bit of a detail. Good news is that there can be spontaneous improvement over time with these vessels that are now either blocked or not working otherwise properly or missing. So we might find alternative routes to start to drain that lymph again. So not everything is lost on that sense. What I wanted to do next is to have a quick look of the lymph and what lymph is made of. Well, lymph contains a lot of stuff that you might be familiar from when we discussed about the contents of the plasma. So large amount of water, proteins, and some other things. In addition to those, we are now going to see white blood cells in great quantities. Not so much because the white blood cells would leak out of the capillaries that we just looked at, but more of because white blood cells are really housed within the lymphatic system. So remember, you always had some amount of white blood cells, and if there is an infection, then the number of those white blood cells increases significantly in response to that. So that's why you might see great numbers of white blood cells if there's an infection. But white blood cells are an important part of the lymph because lymph travels through the lymphatic system, and it is within the lymphatic system where the white blood cells are largely housed. One thing that you'll never see in the lymph, and we shouldn't see in the lymph, and if I would see it, would make me concerned, would be the red blood cells. So we should not have those present. Another thing that I do briefly want to mention when we talk about lymph, so we discussed this whole fluid movement thing. In addition to that, lymph is also made at the bone marrow and the lymph nodes, so contributing to that. We will talk about lymphatic cells, especially when it comes to the immune system, and these are going to be our T cells and B cells, but I'll leave that to the next section that I said that I'll have a look with you, which was the immune system section. All you need to know at this point is that the T cells were the white blood cells that went to mature at the thymus, and B cells maturation took place at the bone marrow. Our focus for the rest of this section is going to be on these supporting cells. And these supporting cells can be divided into two broad categories. We have general tissue, which is a general lymphoid tissue, which is found everywhere in the body. But our focus today is especially on these specialized lymphoid tissues. So we're going to be looking at lymph nodes and also lymphatic organs. So that's where we'll direct our attention. And I'm going to start with the lymph nodes. Lymph nodes are these tiny structures. In numbers, we're talking about somewhere between 400 to 700 pieces of lymph nodes in a typical adult. And their role really is to filter the lymph and kind of purify the lymph, look for any immune system functions that might need to be triggered. You will end up finding that lymph nodes are where the white blood cells were housed. So if there is an inflammation, the number of white blood cells goes up. So as a result, these lymph nodes now end up swelling. Another thing that we see with the lymph nodes is that they are close to the surface, so they're easily accessible for us to have a look of. And I wanted to go through the main sites where we end up finding lymph nodes. Just to, again, this handout is on your canvas. So if you feel that that would be something that would be useful for you to have, you can access it there. But again, the naming follows largely to the body regions that you have learned before. So we have our cervical lymph nodes at the neck region, axillary lymph nodes, the armpit region, supratrochlear lymph nodes. Well, these are above the trochlear notch and our upper limb, where the upper and lower part of the upper limb chains. We have our inguinal lymph nodes, so that was our groin region, abdominal lymph nodes, and our thoracic lymph nodes. So lymph nodes typically are found as these clusters of these kind of small bean-shaped structures. I say small, they're about less in size, less than 1 inch in size. Located, I think some anatomists describe them almost like as pearl necklaces. I don't quite know if I see that when I look at lymph nodes, but located as these clusters, like I said. Lymph nodes are enclosed within a capsule, and there's two parts of those that I do want to highlight to you: the outer part of the lymph node, the cortex, and the inner part of medulla. Within medulla, you will end up finding sinuses. So the sinus was the general term to this kind of an empty space within a structure. Another thing that I wanted to highlight from lymph nodes were the vessels. Vessels that brought lymph into the lymph node were known as afferent lymphatic vessels, and vessels that brought the lymph out of the lymph node were our efferent lymph nodes, so lymphatic vessels. So you'll see the fluid traveling through the lymph node where it got, like I said, filtered and purified, screened for anything that we might need to recruit our immune system for. So having said all that, we see that the swelling of the lymph nodes was in response to white blood cell numbers within the lymph node, now increasing if there's an infection. In addition to feeling that they are swollen, one thing that we are looking for is for the patient to also indicate that they are sore, these lymph nodes, especially sore in general or sore to the touch. If there is no sense of pain, that might be a concern for us. And within the class, I told you a story about why you want to be careful with the using of the word pus. So if you didn't hear that, I'll refer you to talk to your classmates, because it's a little bit of a on the edge of inappropriate story. So you can just check from them. What I wanted to kind of wrap up the lymphatic system with was to have a look of the lymphatic organs, so some of the most important ones that we need to know. And we're going to start with spleen, which is really the largest of the lymphatic organs that we'll have a look of, about a fist-sized, located only on the left side of the abdominal cavity. So only on one side of your body. When we start to think of why spleen is important, what spleen does, that takes us to I refer back to the diagram that we prepared in the class and the group that looked at the abdominal cavity, so that there was a rich blood supply to the spleen. So we had splenic artery, splenic vein. That rich blood supply gives us a clue what does spleen do. So spleen plays an important role in cleaning the blood, removing all dead blood cells, platelets, and so on. In addition to that, another thing that the spleen does is that it stores the iron and the platelets so that they can be reused when these get removed from the blood as this constant turnaround process. And interestingly, in embryos in early life, this is the site where the red blood cells are also being produced from. Can you live without a spleen? Well, if there is a significant injury, damage to the spleen, it might lead into the situation where we need to remove the spleen. In this case, liver and bone marrow would typically take over the functions of the spleen, but this is luckily not often the case. Spleen has a great ability to repair itself, regenerate, so often we don't have to resort to this. The next structure, or a set of structures really, that I wanted to mention were our tonsils, and there's many and they're named based on their location. So we get our palatine tonsil at the posterior oral cavity, lingual tonsil at the base of the tongue, pharyngeal tonsil at the posterior nasopharynx, and the tubal tonsils where the auditory tube opens. So what do tonsils do? They gather and remove pathogens that might pass through or past them. And of course, we've seen that your tonsils can get inflamed. So if tonsils get inflamed, it is possible, if there's a chronic tonsillitis, that we remove someone's tonsils, and we do that for especially younger patients. And it used to be a fairly standard response to a lot of things, but as time has passed, we're realizing that we might not know everything we need to know about tonsils. So let's be a little bit more careful with not jumping into that, and we're becoming a little bit more conservative of when to remove tonsils, because we know it's an important part of the immune system that we don't fully understand yet. Maybe we should not be hacking it away, but still tonsillectomy is an option and is something that we do. Next structure that I wanted to talk about is appendix. So appendix is located where the small intestines, so the first part here, turns into large intestines. So it's the first part of the large intestines at this transition zone. Appendix is kind of this hanging leftover bit, if you wish, and your appendix can get inflamed. If your appendix gets inflamed, we're worried about it bursting. That would cause a whole mess of other trouble, and in response, we might remove the appendix. So if you can live without an appendix, if it can be removed, why would you then have it? Well, it all comes to the fact that we don't quite know and we don't quite understand the role of appendix yet. Some of the best theories that we have available at the moment suggest that it might be an evolutionary remain from the time when our diet was very, very different. So that's where we house some of the bacteria that helped with the digestive processes. I don't know if that's the case, but that's the best speculation that we have at the moment. Like I said, we are, again, the same as with tonsils, becoming a little bit more careful with our eagerness to just chop away parts. Maybe it is that appendix serves a more important role in our body than we've realized. So some of us in medical field are kind of starting to lean towards that maybe we should be a little bit more conservative than just chop it away if as a first response. The next structure that I wanted to talk about is our thymus, large in infants and during your puberty, and then shrinks. You remember that discussion. Remember, these are absolute numbers that we're seeing on this screen. So if you compare them to the body size, that then increases. Really, thymus is proportionally quite large at your birth and even in puberty. But then as you get older, it gets replaced by connective tissue, adipose tissue, and so on. The main function for the thymus was that was the site of the T cell maturation, and we'll have a look of the T cells in just a moment. And the last structure that I wanted to mention was our Peyer's patches. Peyer's patches are these kind of a little bit like tonsil-like structures at the distal part of the small intestines, playing role in destroying bacteria, and that's also where those memory cells were generated. So that concludes everything that I wanted to say about the lymphatic system. I know that it's a lot to go through and it's kind of a general review, so I would not feel upset if someone said that I don't feel that I'm an expert of the lymphatic system. I'm not asking you to be, as long as you can have a general appreciation, you're doing great already. What I was going to do next was just to give like a really, really fast crash course to the immune system. So I'm just going to pull up those slides as well. But like I said, immune system is much more physiological system, so there's less to see with the naked eye. And for that reason, just like we saw with the endocrine system, sometimes students feel that it is a little abstract. So don't feel bad if that's the case. So immune system, when we talk about the immune system, one of the terms that I'll be using is the term pathogen. And I use term pathogen because we can have many different kinds of invaders that try to get into our body, and pathogen is kind of an umbrella term for those. So it can mean anything: viruses, fungi, parasites, anything that shouldn't be trying to get to the body that can cause issues. So a general term for that. The other thing that I wanted to remind ourselves with was the fact that immune system was housed within the lymphatic system, and it's going to be those white blood cells and specialized cells that we will be looking at are how the immune system works. Well, when we start talking about the immune system, one thing that we'll see really fast is that it's actually two separate systems packed under one name, or you can think of it as two branches of a system. So the first part that we'll have a look of is known as innate immunity. This is something that's very general responses, non-specific responses, fast-acting responses, just in general to any pathogens. But we end up finding that these responses are not quite as effective as the other option that we'll see. And the other option that we'll see is known as adaptive immunity. In British-speaking part of the world, where I've spent more time, we actually call it acquired immunity. And I think the word acquired summarizes it a little bit better. So adaptive immunity is very specific for only certain type of pathogen. It initially takes time before it will act, but once you have built an adaptive immunity against something or acquired an immunity against something, we get it really fast. The second time we're exposed to that pathogen, really fast second response, and this response will be specific to that pathogen and much stronger. So adaptive immunity is what we often really think about when we say that someone is immune, has gained an immunity towards something. And this is where the white blood cells become very, very important. But let's start, though, with our innate immunity. So innate immunity, like I mentioned, that was very general, non-specific, and protecting against many different kinds of pathogens. Innate immunity works through different lines of defense. So we try to stop the issue early on, and if it gets past that defense, we have a second and third line of defense against it. So the first line defenses against pathogens in our innate immunity would be to form physical barriers that keep that pathogen away. So skin would be a great example of that. Various mucous membranes that line oral cavity, nasal cavity, maybe reproductive structures, and so on would be, again, good examples of these barriers. How I explain it to students often is this: think of a medieval castle and this outer wall that keeps the invader away. if the invader never gets past that, we don't really need to worry about other lines of defense. The first line of defense has been successful. Well, when first line of defense fails, can be, for example, when these physical barriers get cut, when they are not intact. So, for example, cuts to the skin. And if this takes place, we need to recruit our second line of defenses within the innate immunity. This includes many chemical responses, such as if you eat something that contains a pathogen, well, usually that won't become an issue because by the time it gets to the stomach acids will kill these pathogens. Similarly, sweat is really good at killing a lot of bacteria at the surface of the skin. Your eyes are actually a great route for materials to get into your body. But because they're a great route for materials to get into the body, we recruit this chemical line of defense, tears killing a lot of stuff that would otherwise try to get in. Also kind of rinsing the urethra, urinary tract, especially after intercourse, getting rid of anything that shouldn't be there. If these fails, we have a third response or third line of defense, which would be recruiting the cellular response. This can include cells that are responsible for eating other cells, natural killer cells, antimicrobial substances. And we will talk a little bit about two responses, cell responses. We'll talk about inflammation and we'll talk about fever. So here we see a picture of two pictures of inflamed sites. So it's a local response that we're seeing to an injury. And there's typically 4 or 5 responses or signs and symptoms really for inflammation that textbooks list. I think that the 5 list is a good one. And if we look at these inflammation sites, we can start to see certain things. Well, inflamed sites are typically red. That's because now we're carrying a lot of white blood cells with the blood in general to that local site. So now there's more blood. That site will show the red blood cells through the skin, through the blood vessels. We can see that there's a lot of blood there. Similarly, this local warmth of the site is a result of this blood traveling from the core of the body to these sites. So the blood is a little warmer, carries the heat with it to these local sites. Well, we have a lot of blood, especially white blood cells, but also a lot of blood in general packing to this site. So now there's more material. So as a response, the tissue actually swells. And as there's swelling, that might also cause a sense of discomfort. Remember, there is an injury going on. So pain is usually a response to ongoing or potential threat of tissue damage. The last one that I do like to include refers to the fact that inflamed sites typically don't function as well as they would function otherwise. So this might have a two-folded purpose. So first of all, you don't want to rely on something that's not working well. Say your hand is inflamed. Well, you don't want to be carrying shopping bags because you don't know if it's healthy, if it's able to be up to the job. So we kind of impair the function for that reason, that let's just not use it. We cannot count on it. The other reason is that, remember, there is now an injury going on. We're dealing with that injury. We want to give rest to this side so it has time to recover. So in that sense, this impaired function might be as well beneficial, that it gives this location time to recover. So really, inflammation does a lot of good for us. Inflammation stops the spreading of the injury, helps us to remove a lot of pathogens, alerts rest of the immunity, and gives optimal conditions for the tissue repair to happen. So inflammation, getting rid of all of the inflammation, if it's a healthy inflammation, healthy response to an injury, might not be ideal. And in a class, we discussed in a great extent about the fact that we do have a tendency to kind of over-medicate these days. So we might be over-medicating to get rid of the signs and symptoms of inflammation when it would be good to let that inflammation happen so it helps for the speedy recovery. Another topic that I wanted to talk about was fever. And fever is typically just described as a body temperature that's higher than normal, what we would expect it to be. And then comes a question that, is fever good? Well, fever actually has a lot of benefits for us if there is a cause for the fever. Fever is typically more global, not as localized as we saw the inflammation, so it's throughout the body. A little bit higher body temperature than what's your average helps to inhibit with the microbial growth. Certain microbes are not able to succeed if the temperature is just a little bit higher, so it might be beneficial in that sense. You also might remember from your BIO201, I'm sure you did some lab, that what type of a lab that varies, but where you saw that metabolic reactions were just basically any chemical reactions in your body. If you increase the temperature, the rate of these reactions also increase. So we're getting now faster these chemical reactions taking place. If you're sick, we want them to happen. Well, if you get a fever, that helps us to deal with that. And also a slightly higher temperature help with this phagocytosis, eating the pathogens by the white blood cells, getting rid of them in that way. Of course, we don't want to go crazy with the fever. Fever that's higher than 40 Celsius degrees is a problem. We start to then give you medication to bring down your fever, because if we get any higher than 40 Celsius, we start to destroy our natural amino acids, and that would become an issue and so on. But that little fever, I do think actually serves a lot of purposes, and we sometimes might be too quick to give medicine to get rid of that fever. Remember, same as with inflammation, we now have an injury. We want to take time to get better. So if we medicate you so that we mask the signs and symptoms, you might go back to your day-to-day life while you're still not recovered. So I'm a little bit personally leaning on the side of, if you're sick, be sick, get well, and then get back to the normal life. So that's some of the discussions that we had in the class regarding the fever. There is a group of people, for example, my native people, who believe if fever has all these beneficial benefits, well, maybe we should try to generate an artificial fever, and we actually use sauna for that. They kind of think that maybe it has some of these benefits. We had a discussion in the class again, whether that is true, whether it's not. Are we actually successful in that? There's a little bit of two sides discussing on that, and not a definite answer that I can give to you. So that was our review of our innate immunity. So the general fast responses, not as strong responses. And what we have left to cover from the immune system is the adaptive immunity branch. So remember, I called it acquired immunity as well. And this is where the B cells and T cells become important. Adaptive immunity, it is much more specific, like I said, so deals with particular pathogens. It also doesn't just act as locally, it acts throughout your entire body. And most importantly, adaptive immunity has to do with developing an immunological memory against a pathogen that we have met before. So you meet it the first time, you don't have adaptive immunity yet, you just deal with that pathogen, you get over it, and you move on. Now, if you are exposed to that pathogen for the second time, you actually have a plan how to deal with it. And the second response now is going to be very fast, very efficient, and targeting that particular pathogen. So this is what we talk about when we say that you acquire an immunological memory against a certain thing. Another term that we use in my field is that we talk about your adaptive immunity becoming primed against that pathogen. I have provided this handout in your canvas. So it actually compares the cell-mediated immunity and humoral immunity, the B cells, T cells, kind of where there's overlap, what's the differences. And I'm not expecting you to be experts on that. So I'm just simply leaving that for you to go and refer to if you're interested. We have earlier on talked about the antibodies and antigens. So remember, the antigen was the pathogen, the invader, foreign invader in the body, and antibodies were used then to recognize and act on these. So they're constantly doing surveillance in your body, and if they run into an antigen, they then act on that. Remember that this was kind of a key and lock mechanism. They needed to be a correct match at the active sites. And the other thing that I wanted to mention, antibodies are typically known as immunoglobulins. So we use the term immunoglobulin when we talk about antibodies. There's many different kinds of antibodies. Your textbook kind of prefers to use this Y-shaped structure, but there are others, but we're just going to stick with what your textbook talks about. So we've had a look of the B and T cells very briefly, and like I said, I have further material that you can refer to. A third group of cells that goes with the adaptive immunity that I wanted to mention is the helper cells. One example would be the antigen presenting cells. So they can't themselves deal with this pathogen, but what they do, they detect it and they kind of make it visible for the other parts of the immune system to deal with. B cells, macrophages, dendritic cells are good examples of that. One thing that I do want to take a little bit of time to talk about is the difference between when you meet the pathogen for the first time and when you meet it for the second time. So this is a first slide that I have, and it's kind of a listing of things, and we'll see a visual representation of this in just a second. But when you first meet the pathogen, it can take up to 6 days before you start to experience symptoms. Around day 10, when you get the peak response, you're at your worst. So we're talking of time scale of days, and the immunological response is not super high in terms of the immunoglobulin levels that we just saw. So this sounds an awful lot like COVID-19, for example. Right. The secondary immune response now is the response that we get when we met that pathogen before once, and now we meet for the second time. But during this time, we have had a chance to develop an immunological memory against it. And now we are kind of protected against it. We have a quick blueprint to deal with it. So same antigen at the later time. We're talking rather than from days, we're talking of hours of the responding to that, and this response is going to be much stronger than what we saw with the primary responses. So immunoglobulin levels are going to be much higher. This diagram, I think, quite nicely highlights it. So what we're seeing here, the first exposure, it took about 6 to 10 days for the signs and symptoms to happen, and around day 10, we saw the peak response. But if you look how strong the response in terms of the amounts of immunoglobulins that are being produced is, it is really not that effective. Well, when you meet this pathogen for the second time, you'll see that it's only within the hours that we already see the response and peak response as well. And the response is so much higher and remains these immunoglobulins in your body for much longer time. So much more effective, but you needed to do that priming of the immunological system. So that's hopefully clarifies that a little bit. One thing that we discussed in the classroom a little bit was to do with organ transplants. I really am not going to go into that at this time. If you're interested, I have the full lecture videos available for you. But when you get a transplant and it's not part from your own body, the issue that we face is the organ transplant rejection, because your immune system now steps in and says that this is a pathogen. So we might need to turn off your immune system to deal with it. We also had a look of some of the most common transplants. Kidney and liver are so high up on the list because it's easy to get donors. You can live with one kidney, so you can donate the other one. Liver is amazingly good at regeneration. So again, liver transplants are common. Heart and lungs are not easy to come by, but they're kind of things that you need, you can't live without. So that's why they make it high on this list, even though they're harder. We also talked about the success of organ transplants in the class. And one thing that we saw initially, the success rates are good, but once we get to the year 5, 10, 15, there is a higher risk of transplant failure. So really, I think that the quote that I've included here is one of my favorites. It shows that transplants have an issue that, yes, they might save your life, but you might be paying for that for the rest of your life by having to deal with this managing the immune system responses so we don't get the transplant rejection. I also typically would talk a little bit of examples of different kinds of conditions that go with the immune system, but I'm going to leave that for you to do independently. That's again on the full lecture videos that you can refer to. And that completes the lecture material for this chapter that I have. So the only thing that I have left to show for this chapter that I want to kind of, for the sake of completedness, point out to you has to do with the lab and lab for this week. Luckily, if you were not able to make it to the class, luckily for you, this lab is actually a dry lab, so you're able to complete it fully at home. So when you go to the herd immunity simulation on your canvas, you will quickly see that there is the lab worksheet, so you can just download it yourself, use the link to the herd immunity simulator that I provided for you. And what you will be doing as part of the lab, you'll be adjusting some of these values. And once you have adjusted them, you trigger a disease progress within the community and follow how much and what spreads within the community then based on the condition. So here where we have higher spreading, you will actually start to see who gets infected, who does not. But let's go through that lab just briefly together. I want to make sure that you have everything you need to be able to complete this week's assignment. So let me just share this with you. So like I showed you where to find the lab, what to do for that. And I'll just take a couple of words to get us thinking. This is something that I always feel a little uncomfortable, especially with the strong opinions that people tend to have about the COVID vaccines and vaccines in general. We have to be respectful that not everyone thinks the way you might think. So what I ask from my students is that you can have your views, you can have your beliefs. I will always respect them. I will never grade you down if you don't think the way I do. But that doesn't mean that you get to be rude to others either. So we will approach this as a scientific activity. We will not take sides, and we will collect some data and make some conclusions based on that data. But your beliefs, I completely respect those. So a really quick kind of a review of immunity. We've been looking so far direct immunity on our discussions. And two ways you could gain a direct immunity was that if you were previously exposed to a disease, now you develop that immunological memory that we just looked at. Or the other option is that you are given a vaccination, and that helps you to develop that immunological memory. So a lot of vaccines are either weakened forms of the pathogens or partial pathogens, just so enough that we can develop a response against it, or even just unfunctional killed versions of the pathogen. We don't want to make you really sick, but we want you to develop that immunological memory so that you gain that previous exposure. So next time you meet it, you're protected. So that was our direct immunity. Indirect immunity is a little different. So one way that you can gain indirect immunity is through the maternal antibodies that you received during the pregnancy from the mother through the placenta. Of course, when you stop receiving these antibodies through the placenta after you're born, this passive immunity will wear off over time. Breastfeeding is great, shown to be successful at passing some of the passive immunity to the child for the duration of the breastfeeding. But what we're going to be interested is the indirect immunity, the part of that known as herd immunity. And let's have a look at what's happening with the herd immunity. Well, herd immunity really refers to the fact that when we have a large enough percentage of the entire population that has become immune to the pathogen, then even those who are not immune, who are in that population, are still protected. And I think an illustration illustrates that really well, or demonstrates that well. So here on a red color symbol that we have is an individual who's infected and can potentially make others sick. On this diagram, these individuals who are marked with blue color, these are all the vaccinated people against this disease. But there's always going to be some people we cannot vaccinate. And these people are now vulnerable if they get in touch with this individual who's carrying the disease. Well, if we have acquired a herd immunity, what will happen that as large enough number of people are now vaccinated, the chances that this individual with the disease that's actively spreading it might not even get in touch with these vulnerable people, simply based on the numbers. And in this way, it is the herd immunity, the crowd, that's protecting the ones that cannot get immunized against this pathogen. So I hope that that makes sense. And that actually brings me to the discussion that I don't think that in real world it's feasible for us to reach 100% vaccination rate a lot of time. This can be because some individuals might be allergic to the components of a vaccine, or they might be so sick that they cannot be vaccinated. They might have compromised immune system, so they can't deal even with the vaccine. Or it could be that people have religious beliefs or other beliefs that make it their personal choice that they choose not to get vaccinated. And we have to respect that as well, the personal choice and freedom of the personal choice. So it's unrealistic that we're not gonna get everyone vaccinated. However, if we get enough people vaccinated in the population, that's gonna protect also these people who cannot get vaccinated because of the herd immunity, as we saw on that previous diagram. There's safety in numbers, even for those who could not get vaccinated. So for example, in this example, it could be too young to get vaccinated, or they could be sick otherwise, so they couldn't deal with the vaccine. But they are all protected by the number of other people. So that brings us to our lab. And in the actual electronic version of the lab worksheet, you will find a link that you just click, or on that lab that you open from the canvas, you can just click on that link and it takes you to the simulator of the herd immunity. And as you work through the simulator, you will first of all see the whole population as these circles. Any circles that are green, they mean that they are vaccinated individuals. Any circles that are red means that they are unvaccinated. And once you have all of your settings correct, you click somewhere there and the disease will start spreading through the population. And you can see who gets infected, who doesn't. So it's really doing maths and doing maths for you. What you will be changing is the immunization rate on the software. So initially it's set at an immunization rate of 90%, but I will ask you to work through different kinds of immunization rates and collect that data on these data sheets that I provided as part of the lab. So you run 5 trials for each condition, and then you calculate the average for each of these trials for the numbers that you get. Like I said, there's going to be always a little bit of variation. That's the nature of statistics. So that's why we do multiple runs and then collect the data and look at the average data. So I'll let you work through that, collect your data. And once you have the data, that helps you to tackle some of the questions that I have as activity questions for you. So I have 5 questions. The first one asks you to explain the relationship between the immunization rate and the percentage of population that gets infected. If you have run this assimilation, what you'll notice is that a higher immunization rate results in lower infection rate. So if enough people get vaccine, we're going to get less of the infection in the entire population. So that's something along those lines. You don't need to use my words, but something along the similar words is what I'm after there on the first question. The second question asks about the percentage of unvaccinated population that gets infected when the immunization rate increases. And of course, we saw again that as the immunization rate goes up, the percentage of unvaccinated individuals that become infected goes down. So this is really a demonstration of how herd immunity works and everything that we have discussed so far about this lab. The third question asks you whether there is a point in your data that you're analyzing now where you will see that the unvaccinated population seems to be protected from the infection, and what that point is. Well, we all will have a subjective take on what's the proper value for that. So you do your judgment, and what we'll end up seeing is that it's somewhere around 50 to 70 in my eyes. But your judgment can be different. How much evidence do you need before you're convinced? So again, this is up to your data collection and where your mind and where your beliefs take you. But as enough people get immunized, get vaccinated, also those unvaccinated people become protected. And that's why typically in the literature, we see that we need to get a vaccination rate at least above 50%, closer to 70% in an ideal world. And that brings us to talk about this vaccination rate number in the next question. I'm asking you what happens if the vaccination rate is 0? Well, if it's a 0, no one's vaccinated, so everyone will get sick because there's really no protection against that disease. If the vaccination rate was